Hello, my name is Paul Arnold, sometimes known as a stuttering professor. I'm a strategic planner, facilitator and trainer amongst other things. And as you can see, I've read a load of books and I've summarised over 50 business related books. And today I want to talk about this book, Turn the Ship Around, a true story of turning followers into leaders by L. David Marquet. Basically, the book in a nutshell really basically recounts a real turnaround story by adopting a very different leadership mentality culture, where it moved away from a classic command and control leader follower passive style with one person making all the decisions to a disseminated leader style where people were empowered to make decisions within their fields of expertise. And the key mantra in this book is I intend to, as opposed to permission to. So let's dig in the book. The book is basically about a former US Navy Captain L. David Marquet, who was appointed commander to the USS Santa Fe, a nuclear-powered submarine. And it was the worst performing boat in the whole fleet, plagued by low morale, poor performance, high turnover rates, and in just 12 months, he transformed that boat to having the best results in the whole US Navy or fleet. Now, the book's quite fun because it didn't happen overnight. He made lots of mistakes along the way. But this was down to him realizing that what had worked was not going to work now. And you've got to remember, he's working in a very tightly cultured way of doing this, in the US Navy. So in that sense, he was breaking massive traditions about this stuff. And he had this sort of epiphany where he saw leadership to be a system, not some internal personality trait. So in other words, we can do this, we can all do this if we apply some principles and see it as a system rather than some personal personality traits. The first thing he said as one of his tenets of approach is empowered decision making. In other words, the person who has the most knowledge of the situation is often the better person to make the right decision. Marquet, who had come off ships, had recognised that he was an expert in submarines. And so for him to be asked to make decisions about stuff was wrong. And he had one particular incident where a sailor asked him to make a decision and he made the wrong decision because he didn't know enough about, the submarine. And he knew that it was better to actually change it around. And this massive shift to say, you know more about this than me. You make the decision. You ask permission of me, but if that makes sense, I'm going to follow your lead. So almost a turning the stuff around about who owns the responsibility. The next thing is clarity of the big picture. Decision making must always be made in context of the bigger picture. You've got to know what the mission is. You've got to know all that stuff. So in the old days, it's very much sort of a case of, on only a need to know basis. And you need to change it. I said, no, I'm going to tell people what we're doing, because then people can make the right decision based upon what is the right long-term outcome rather than what's the best in this small space. One of the classic ones is failure as a lesson. So when things went wrong, he wanted to focus more on what's the learning? How can we make sure we don't do it again, rather than apportioning blame? And so there was an open discussion, and because there wasn't blame, people were more open to share what was really going on. And then there was the idea about thinking out loud. So in other words, officers were encouraged to think out loud before taking action. And this meant that if someone was doing some off thinking, they could be sort of, questioned about it in advance. So you could catch the errors early on before decision making was made. So a greater transparency about the why behind why they were thinking the way they were thinking. And this also meant that junior officers got to learn the thinking process of senior officers, and therefore accelerated their own development. The next one was the idea of power to challenge. So Marquet encouraged psychological safety so that his crew could feel safe to question any other person's decision making, to make sure that you don't get what was said in black box sort of thinking. This idea that, only the person in command can't be challenged. Because let's be quite frank, a lot is at risk when you are in charge of a submarine. And then upskilling, another classic one, it's really important that people have a lot of knowledge, and therefore he really changed it like we've really got to upskill people and give people mastery so they become super experts in their field. And that therefore meant that people felt more valued, and were really seen as being the experts in that space. So really built their self-worth. Another concept was briefing up, not down. So again, going back to you're the real experts here. So you're going to be briefing up to me rather than me briefing down to you. And then proactive, not reactive. Marquet instilled a culture of initiative taking, rather than to replace the passivity of waiting to be told what to do, which is the classic command and control structure within the Navy. This is much more, no, you tell me, you're seeing this stuff, what do you think we should be doing? Let's think ahead of the problem rather than sort of waiting upon it. And then he also had this thing about in creating real pride. So what Marquet instituted was the 3-name rule. Whenever the crew or members interacted with civilians or other sort of units, they were expected to introduce themselves, the submarine and their role. This therefore meant that they really owned who they were. They owned the community. They took pride and responsibility in that they were part of that ship. So a critique, look, I thought it was a very readable book. Very interesting hearing about it. With all these books, there's a whole leadership genre of look how wonderful I did that, look how I turned this around. And I think there's a lot of sort of post-rationalization that goes on that makes it sound as if it, was this miraculous thing. And obviously, we've got to take all that with a pinch of salt. But a lot of the principles make common sense, and I think that he was very brave to go and challenge the paradigms of the Navy, and that was, I think, one of the strongest things. Now, look, again, as with all leadership is messy, difficult managing people, and therefore this idea of having this very clear, coherent strategy, of course, belies the reality of the messiness of what really goes on. But I think, this idea about empowering people, trusting in them, is a fundamentally really strong thing. So overall, I think, some very clear lessons. Is it right for everything? No, of course not. No leadership book ever is. But I think, it was a good book, and he's written another book which is all about the language of leadership as well. So I think it's one of those sort of like holiday books, I would suggest, but enjoy it.